Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Storytime with Mr. Jackson. And in this episode, we'll be going over William Barentz's second voyage north. And so, without further ado, the fleet returned home a few days before the start of fall, with every man aboard just sure that they had found a new route to China. And not only did they bring news of the true route to the Orient, but the crews also brought back holds full of moist animal pelts, several barrels of whale oil, and even 2 live falcons. And news of their success spread far and wide across Holland, filling the heads of the rich and powerful with all sorts of ideas. And this was due in no small part to our boy von Linschoten, who upon reaching home ran his mouth to anyone and everyone who would listen. Von Linschoten had become kind of a big deal recently, as by now his atlas to the eastern seas had been published in full, and of course, he knew all the right people. And for months von Linschoten was the life of the party, with folks both great and small staying up till all hours of the night just to hear his stories of green mists, icebergs, and white monsters. But despite the joyous atmosphere, some of the more stern and serious merchants voiced their doubts, for these were self-made men of the early modern era, street-smart gangsters whose entire success hinged on their management of risk. And all these joyless Protestants really wanted to know is if this year's results could be repeated, or if Ney and von Linschoten had simply blundered through the Straits of Nassau by sheer dumb luck. These serious men went on to point out that the North was an ever-changing beast, that seeing open water one year didn't necessarily guarantee you would see it the next. For these men had read much on the subject, learning what they could from the Scandinavians and the English. These sources all said that ice was the floating embodiment of chaos, entropy made solid and given form. But these voices were but shouts in a crowd, for the vast majority of people were still very excited. All they really needed to know was that ships had made it through once. The rest would just kind of work itself out. After gathering all the necessary funds, the next few months were spent hiring available crew and outfitting 7 brand new ships for the long voyage east. And again, Ney was in command, this time aboard the massive cargo ship Griffin, with Barentsz and von Linschoten aboard the slightly smaller Greyhound and Hope respectively. And others were now among the fleet that would become more important with time. Men such as Gerrit de Veer, diarist and mapmaker, and my primary source for most of what comes next. Or Jacob von Heemskerk, ice pilot, soldier, and future hero of the Republic. But more on him later. This year, most of the ships were packed full of fine trade goods and anything else they thought the Chinese might want or at the very least find amusing. And the 7th and last ship was kept light, its mission to turn back when they reached Chinese waters so that more ships could be sent immediately. Now the expedition's backers knew that going north wouldn't be a walk in the park, and as such, each ship was kitted out with a year and a half's worth of food, along with several dozen cannons and a complement of marines. Not a bad idea considering how much wealth each trade ship contained. Wouldn't want anyone getting any ideas. I mean, just look up the wreck of the Batavia if you want to see that scenario play out. Well, that next summer of 1595, 7 ships assembled off the island of Texel and waited some more. And frustratingly, they sat there for literal weeks waiting for any fair wind to carry them away. There's just one among dozens of fleets left stranded in the Zuiderzee that season. And it wouldn't be until early July of 1595 that they were able to put out, almost a full month later than last year. Not an auspicious start. And even after they clawed their way free of home port, storms and seemingly random misfortunes followed them the whole way up the Norwegian coast. According to the book Icebound, one day during such a storm, Barentz's ship the Greyhound was unexpectedly pulled toward von Linschoten's Hope, the 2 ships soon colliding, snapping the masts of the Hope and tossing them aside like toys. And the wreck had occurred so suddenly that most of the men hadn't had time to brace, and the impact unfortunately caused 4 crewmen of the Hope to be tossed overboard, each man as good as dead in the black foaming seas. But against all odds, both ships soon decoupled and remained afloat, the crew spending the rest of the storm in terror and apprehension, flinching at every wave and dark smudge at the edge of their vision. Well, the next morning the storm abated, and the fleet quickly found a safe place to moor for much-needed repairs. And once at anchor, they took stock of the damage and held a small service for their 4 lost crewmates, resigning them to the unpredictable North Sea. They then got to work refitting the Hope, repairing her snapped masts and mending the pulverized gunnels. You have to remember, despite the hardships and bad luck, these guys were professionals. They had all the materials and know-how to make an entire new ship in the field if they had to. A feat that was actually accomplished in 1741 by Vitus Bering's men. The incident seeing the survivors use a reclaimed patchwork vessel to escape over the Bering Sea back to civilization. But that's a story for another day. Well, the ship's now seaworthy. They headed out once more, but it soon became clear that they were being followed. But this was no enemy. In fact, it was another Dutch vessel. Well elated as they were to see a fellow Dutchman out this far, the news they brought kinda pissed everyone off. For as it turned out, the ship had left a full 2 weeks after the fleet had. They were losing precious time. Well, a few days after that, they met yet another Dutch ship, this one endearingly named the Iron Hog, and together they formed a rather impressive 9-ship convoy, mightiest fleet in all the North. But eventually they reached the end of known trade routes, and there the crews exchanged some letters and bid each other well. As they pressed southeast toward the Russian mainland, the Grand Fleet encountered true sea ice for the first time. As the men who had been here last year looked around, it became clear that last winter must have been a rough one, for the entire landscape and seas around them seemed different somehow. And indeed things were different, for this was more ice than even the veterans had seen last year, with the seas ahead all but impassable to even the lightest ships among them. But in spite of all that, they pressed on. At times the ships would thread single file between massive cliffs of ice, and at others they were forced to push hunks of ice out of their path with oars and boat hooks. And still at others they clawed their way forward with ropes and ice anchors. But despite the many hardships, the fleet soon made their way through the rock tumbler and eventually reached Voyages and the Straits of Nassau, von Linschoten's gateway to fortune and empire. But right about then, scouts began to make some most unwelcome observations, for the entire span of the Straits of Nassau was covered in a giant ice dam. Thousands of hunks, both big and small, piled on top of one another at the choke point like laundry on a teenager's floor, nigh inaccessible. Well, Ney and the officers were now beginning to grow a little bit anxious. Not so much because of the ice. I mean, hell, the same thing had happened last year. It was almost expected. No, Ney was a man who knew how to read a room, and he could see that his men were beginning to crack, with sailors shirking duties and men speaking in hushed tones only for their conversations to cease once the officers walked past. And I mean, he really couldn't blame them. Most of these guys had never seen ice before, and now they were thrown into conditions that made even the veterans sweat and curse. Well, the Admiral decided that the crews needed a break, some time to refit and gather their thoughts. So Ney gave the order for the fleet to tack away from the clogged straits, fighting winds and currents as they ground their way south. And finally, after hours of nerve-shattering ice sailing, the fleet made for a small natural harbor on the west coast of Voyages, and there everyone collapsed from exhaustion and took a much-needed nap. Well, the next morning, scouts went inland to survey the area from a rocky prominence. But these scouts weren't terribly happy with what they saw when they got there, for when they looked out, the seas were frozen solid as far as the eye could see. Had they stayed anchored near those straits, they would all be iced in right now, just as the Russian expedition had 2 years previous. Crushed and stranded. It really could happen that quickly. Well, the scouts soon returned with news of Russian sealers not far from their safe harbor, which seems to have excited Ney a whole lot, for he almost immediately put down his anchors and sent 54 men ashore, for surely one of them could find someone to talk to. Now, he wanted to send the right message, something that made it clear to the natives that these newcomers were friends and allies, no threat at all. So, Ney ordered them ashore, armed to the teeth with arquebuses and halberds, with their breastplates gleaming in the midnight sun. And this army of friendship had standing orders to pursue but not engage the locals. Because, nothing screams friendly like a bunch of dudes open carrying and actively running after you on sight. Sounds like a freaking nightmare if I'm being honest. And this army spent most of the day combing the island for someone to talk to, but to no avail. The natives were too well hidden and not about to speak with these well-armed conquistadors. No, they simply melted into the hills and hid out until the invaders just went away. But despite not being able to corner any terrified natives, the day wasn't a total bust. For somewhere inland, a group of men managed to find a supply depot of some kind. As it turns out, the place seemed to be a gathering spot, a depot of some kind for year-round exchange between the natives and the Russian. And apparently their invasion had interrupted this little Arctic flea market. Oh well. The Dutchmen attempted to smooth things over with the locals by leaving some trade goods behind at the depot. They figured that the natives would go back and find all sorts of new goodies and come to the conclusion that the Dutchmen weren't so bad after all. Now, according to the book Icebound, the rest of the day went great. Until it didn't.
Now, back to 2.5 Men.
For once back on ship, it soon came to light that a few men had stolen some rather expensive-looking pelts from the trade depot. So now, instead of being stoked on the Dutch, remembering them as handsome, well-hung folk bearing gifts, they would instead be remembered as invaders who stomp around your homes and steal your crap. Great. Well, Ney had to set an example. These men and their filthy little peasant fingers had put Dutch honor, and by extension, Dutch interests in jeopardy. Unforgivable. And so, after a short questioning, Ney ordered the offending men to be keel-hauled. Now, keel-hauling wasn't uncommon in the Dutch Navy, or many other navies of the time for that matter, but this is the only instance I can recall of it happening in Arctic waters, from any nation, mostly because it's insane. For those of you not in the know, when you keel-haul someone, you tie a rope around the hands and another around the feet, and then the victim is lowered into the water. Now, using the opposing ropes to keep the man pressed against the underside of the ship, the men aboard haul. A small group on one side to pay out the line, and another on the other to do the actual pulling. And in this way, the victim is dragged underwater whilst being scraped against the underside of the ship. Think of it like butt flossing, only it's a dude being torn up like a cheese grater.
Ew, that's so disgusting. I hope I don't ever accidentally use that towel.
Now that sounds fine until you think about it for more than like 2 seconds, as the undersides of wooden sailing ships were almost always encrusted with rock-like barnacles, loose nails, jagged hardware, and in this particular case, ice. And any one of those obstacles could open a man up like a zipper, spilling his life into the cold water. Oh, but that's not all. Oh no, for these were freezing waters, my friend. Not to mention, most sailors couldn't swim. So when these guys hit the water, their first impulse was to gasp, taking in freezing water into their lungs as they did. Now this influx of near-freezing salt water causes shock to set in almost immediately, and the man begins to drown, panic causing him to take in more and more water as his body hyperventilates in a vain attempt at self-preservation. So basically a death sentence. If you don't drown, you'll probably be cut up so bad that you die of infection later. Real fun, that'll show 'em. Aren't we monkeys so creative? Well, once the third man went in, the crew hauled on the ropes as fast as they could, as all were eager to make the man's trip as short as possible. They had already seen the state of the other two, and I'm guessing they were starting to feel just a little bad about it, so they hurried. But when the man was about halfway through, the line suddenly stopped dead. It was snagged. They yanked a few times more, desperate to get the gasping sailor moving again. Seconds passed, but still the line wouldn't move. They needed to think of something, anything. This man was going to die. And so there was only one thing for it. And each man looked around to the other as if to confirm. And so this time they pulled with all their strength, each man pushing past whatever mental limit he had set for himself. They would see their crewmate freed. And on the last and hardest pull, the resistance lessened and the back line went slack. They had done it. High on adrenaline, the crew let out a collective cheer, and now they found hauling the man much easier, each sailor feeling twice as strong as he had been only a few moments before. But almost immediately the cheering stopped, for the man's pale arms came up first, limp and white as a ghost, and then his face drawn into an indescribable expression of pain and terror, and then, to the absolute horror of his crewmates, nothing else. Only the man's upper half came up the opposing side of the ship, his lower torso and legs nowhere to be found. No matter how it had happened, they had all just ripped their former shipmate clean in two. Well, a few days after that, Ney realized he was getting nowhere fast. He wanted to get moving, probably more than anyone, but dared not send his big ships out into the ice for fear of being crushed. So, in order to distract the men, Ney ordered some light yachts forward on a scouting mission, hoping for any good news. But the gods of Nova Zembla were fresh out, and the remaining ships would soon be forced to fight for their lives as they sat at anchor. For their safe harbor soon turned into a liability, as icebergs, both big and small, began to crash into the bay, first by the twos and fews, and then by the dozen. And the next 24 hours or so was filled with many close calls and near misses of a similar vein, and each ship took its fair share of abuse, one yacht even being forced to beach in order to escape the grinding weather. Well, despair infected everyone that night, each man wondering even more loudly than before if they had made a mistake, if they ever could or even would be allowed to escape this place. But as if nature or some capricious god knew they were at their limit, the weather soon turned warm and still. Perfect sailing weather, were not for all the damned ice. Well, Ney soon ordered his remaining yachts back into the ice, desperate for any good news. and they soon spread out around the island and surrounding pack ice, one encountering a Russian ship sitting at anchor not long after setting out. And as it turned out, these Russians had just survived the last winter, iced into a natural harbor not far up the coast. It was soon explained that they were sitting at anchor waiting for another ship that had also spent the winter alongside them. The two had been separated a few days ago in the same storm that had nearly smashed the Dutch at anchor. But these men didn't seem too worried, for they went on to explain that the ice of this region was unpredictable and prone to trapping ships in their places of refuge. They were willing to wait as long as they had to. Well, the Dutch thought that was all well and good and everything, but they already knew that. They asked the Russians about the straits and begged to know if they would be clear of ice at any point this year. Now, the Russians went on to claim that the straits would be clear for at least 10 weeks and that the Kara Sea beyond was ice-free. But as for any more information, they simply shrugged, explaining that none of them ever went that far, but they only knew of men who did. Other scouts returned with even better news, for these men had spotted a way through the ice to their south, wide enough for the entire fleet to fit through. All they had to do now was sail between Voyages and the Russian mainland, and they would be home free. Well, it was tough going, but the entire fleet soon made their way into the southern straits. This was it. They could finally get moving. But not long into the trip, a vast plain of ice was spotted to their southeast. But that was negativity talking. They weren't in the mood for bad news, so they just kept pushing. But more bad news followed, as it soon became clear that they had sailed into a giant horseshoe of ice. There was no way around or even through it, the sheet extending out beyond sight from the mainland to Voyages itself. Well, now confronted with pack ice so thick that even a modern icebreaker might give it pause, they were forced back. The fleet would have to try something new. Again. They spent a few hours at anchor just staring at the pack ice and letting the men sleep off some of their depression, but soon they found that the eerie plain that had blocked them was moving at them. And so a race began to escape the false straits before the ice could grind them to splinters. A race they just barely won. And so, at the end of the day, the battered fleet sailed sullen and bitter into the very harbor they had departed so hopefully only a few days before. The very same place where men once feared they would never be allowed to leave. But even as they sat there bobbing in the one patch of liquid left in all the north, Barentsz and the men from Amsterdam began to pester Ney about going forward. For Barentsz was a man for whom even rash action was better than idleness. And Barentsz figured if the south was clogged with ice, then maybe he could use the northern route he had discovered last year, contending that he could spend the winter up there and get a jump on things upon first thaw. After all, he and his men had found an entire town abandoned on the coast last year. It would make an excellent place to winter over. Just, don't mind the skeletons. Well, right about that time, he must have looked over to see Ney frothing at the mouth with rage. But the Admiral stifled his emotions long enough to calmly, and in no uncertains, tell Barentsz no. Not just no, but hell no. And shut up. No, Ney had little faith in the crews. The man was already feeling like he was barely holding them together as it was, and he saw no use at all in pushing them over the edge with talk of wintering over in this godforsaken hellhole. No, they would put out as soon as possible, and God willing, stay on mission. And if not, well, just stay alive. In order to pass the time while iced in, groups of men made their way onto shore, or at least the hunting was good. And on one such expedition, some scouts stumbled onto a group of native Nennet men pulled on reindeer sleds.
What is it? What do you smell? Man flesh.
I'll give the next part to Devere. Then our interpreter went alone towards them to speak with them, which they perceiving sent one toward us, who, coming almost to our men, took out an arrow from his quiver, offering to shoot at him. Wherewith our interpreter, being without arms, was afraid, and cried unto him, saying in Russian speech, "Shoot not, we are friends." Which the other hearing cast his bow and arrows to the ground, wherewith giving him to understand that he was well content to speak with our man. Which done, our man called to him once again and said, "We are friends." Whereunto he made an answer and said, "Then you are welcome," and saluting one another, bended both their heads down to the ground after the Russian manner. And this group of friendly natives soon followed the Dutchmen back to the fleet, where they spent the rest of the day just chilling on the bay ice and giving out sleigh rides, and fun times were had by all, except von Linschoten. He sucks. Well, at some point during the party, one of the Dutchmen got a little overzealous and shot off his harquebus like it was New Year's in Detroit. Devere. One of our men shot a musket towards the sea, wherewith they, the natives, were in so great fear that they ran and leapt like madmen. Yet at last they satisfied themselves when they perceived that it was not maliciously done to hurt them. and we told them by our interpreter that we used our pieces instead of our bows, whereat they wondered because of the great blowing noise that it gave and made. And to show them what we could do wherewith, one of our men took a flat stone about half a handful broad and set it up upon a hill a good way off from him, which they perceiving and thinking that we meant somewhat thereby, 50 or 60 of them gathered round us, and yet somewhat far off, wherewith he that had the piece shot it off, and with the bullet smote the stone in sunder, whereat they wondered much more than before. After that we took our leaves of one another with great friendship on both sides. But soon after that, an elder came back to the ships wearing a scowl, for it had come to his attention that someone had stolen an idol from his people. The elder then poked around for a bit, soon finding a small figurine tucked away in some guy's belongings. The old man then went on to chide the Dutchmen for their light fingers and upbraid them for touching such a holy object with their heathen hands. And yes, the irony was totally lost on the Dutchman. Well, the offender wasn't punished this time, which leads me to believe that someone untouchable must have stolen it. Otherwise, I'm sure Nay would have flayed the man alive or put him on a thumbscrew or cut off his frickin' hand or something. A few days later, the ice began to weaken and then break up, and scouts soon reported that the ice was beginning to flow out of the harbor mouth. Well, this led Barentsz as well as others to speculate that the straits to their north might be ice-free now. They pointed out the wicked storms and warming weather, guessing that such agitation and energy might have freed the blockage to their north. If they hurried, they might even be able to run the straits, these men doing their best to stoke new hopes that their mission might yet succeed. Well, the fleet decided to go for it, and so they began to claw their way out, painstakingly hauling on anchors and chopping at ice floes, some ships having more trouble than others. But eventually they all freed themselves and moved on. The next day, the fleet was forced to split as the ice began to shift around them, and to make matters worse, a dense fog began to blanket the seas ahead, reducing visibility to only a few feet in front of the prow of each vessel. And to make matters even worser, the wind decided to die at that exact moment. And so, with no ability to tack or steer, the captains of each vessel knew well that collisions would be unavoidable. And so they drifted, each ship pinging from collision to collision as they flowed imperceptibly north on the currents. Several of the ships soon found themselves alone among the violently shifting ice, communicating with the others via harquebus fire and trumpets. Sometimes the ships were forced to run the gaps between monstrous bergs, praying that all the while that the Leviathans didn't slam their jaws closed on them. They were on their own now, each ship more alone than ever. No help could be offered, as no one could maneuver, let alone stop to turn around. Each ship would have to find its own way out of this complicated nightmare of shifting ice. But vigilance and good piloting at the rudder soon saw them through it, the ships, if not the nerves of their crew, still mostly intact. And so, splintered and traumatized, they managed to regroup at States Island of all places. Yeah, the crews and officers must have looked out at States Island and just been like, huh, awestruck and just a bit numb. For if they were here, it meant that they had gotten through the straits. So, that was something, I guess. Well, desperate for rest, the men put into the same harbor where the crystals and freshwater springs had been found last year. They weighed anchor and all gave a collective sigh. But just as the crews began to feel some semblance of fleeting hope, the actual hope, most unlucky ship of the fleet was struck by a free-floating iceberg hard enough to cause lifeboats to be scrambled from each ship in response. All was chaos, but somehow, the Hope's weird luck held true, and the green wood of the hull sprung back as if it were made of rubber, becoming more or less watertight again. But even still, though, she'd now become grounded on a massive iceberg, and it would take the rest of the day to pry her off it. Not like they needed one, but this was just a reminder that any one of these hunks of ice could take them to the bottom. Or apparently even raise them to the sky, who the hell knew anymore? Either way, everyone was now more on edge than ever. But somehow, this was the good part of their day, as more sea ice soon floated in after them. And so, while trying to lever one ship off the ice, the rest of the fleet had to try to dodge more as they came on. Well, the next morning, scouts from on high reported more grim news, for stretching from north to south and blocking the entirety of the eastern seas before them was another endless plain of ice. The Kara Sea, the one everyone said never froze, was a brick, a single block of shifting ice. And it was moving at them. And to make matters worse, their safe harbor was now almost completely encased in ice, with a small lead newly frozen over their only way out. And so they wasted no time, the ships forming a column and blasting through the thinly frozen lead like their lives depended on it. And still tired and nerves not yet settled, They put in on the other side of States Island, hoping to use the land itself to block the all-conquering ice. And once at anchor, they all watched in despair as hunks of ice crashed into the straits, erasing their old harbor, and now advancing like the Hun on their new one. They felt like they were just being stalked, driven into a trap. But they had little choice, and so they put out again farther down the coast until they spotted another sheltered spot near some cliffs. It looked as good a place as any, so they put in and tied their ships together so a rogue swell didn't bash them to pieces. And the past week had just been about the worst of all their lives, because constantly they had gotten their hopes up, only for things to deteriorate farther and farther. Morale plummeted, with few words being spoken even amongst friends. Fatalism had now taken home of a good portion of the Second Dutch Expedition north. And Admiral Ney and the officers could see full well that the situation had degraded, that the men were numb, their faces a blank mask. They needed something, just anything to lift their spirits. And so the officers concluded that a trip ashore would do everyone some good. And so they let it be known that anyone who wanted to go ashore to look for shiny rocks or hunt game was free to do so, that no man needed to ask. Well, dozens of the crew obliged, with each man thankful for a chance to do as he liked for a change. And this did seem to improve morale a bit, as talk soon turned from despair and anger to who found the biggest and clearest crystal and how much such things might be worth back home. And laughter and good-spirited conversation began to break out all across States Island as small groups combed her shores and climbed her peaks, laughing and playing like babes in the wilderness. And all was peaceful, until it wasn't. For without warning, one of the men was grabbed off his feet, screaming in terror, blood spraying everywhere as if he were a henchman in a Tarantino movie. The man's two companions turned back only to see their comrade being mauled by a gigantic polar bear, its teeth locked behind the poor man's neck and jaw. The damn thing had snuck up on all of them, the huge animal barely making a sound as it came on. Well, the man's two companions froze, looking on helplessly even as their comrade attempted to fight back, stabbing at the beast with a small knife, each jab a little more feeble than the one before it as the life drained from him. The bear's fur and all the surrounding snow now stained a deep red. Well, the two men eventually broke out of their stupor and ran away screaming. A very reasonable response, all things considered. I mean, what the hell were they supposed to do, fist fight a polar bear? Well, the bear ignored the two fleeing men and went back to tearing at its prey's jaw until it broke free. Well, the fleeing men regrouped with the other men on shore and tried their best to explain what the hell had just happened. That a white monster just ate their friend. A few of the braver men went slightly ahead of the group and began screaming and hollering all manner of obscenities at the bear. For you see, these men were big and tough. They feared no bear, and it was very important to them that the monster knew that. Well, the bear was still gnawing on the dead sailor when she glanced up to see 7 or so angry little Dutchmen charging over the frozen beach towards her. And calmly, she simply dropped her prey and squared her stance. She had not the inclination to kill any more of them, but if they insisted on challenging her, well, she could always go for seconds. And so, before the group knew it, the massive bear began barreling toward them, her dead black eyes fixed on them like never before. The tough guys immediately broke and ran in the other direction, for they all knew at once that this bear was, different, and it was all too simple for her to overtake the slowest man. In only a few seconds, she had killed yet another crewmate. Or, according to De Vere, the bear at the first, falling upon the man, bit his head in sunder and sucked out his blood. Wherewith the rest of the men that were on land, being about 20 in number, ran presently thither, either to save the man, or else to drive the bear from his dead body. And, having charged their pieces and bent their pikes, set upon her that was still devouring the man. But, perceiving them to come towards her, fiercely and cruelly ran at them, and got another of them from our company, which she tore to pieces, wherewith all the rest of us ran away. Well, the men still aboard ship had watched the terror unfold, and as quickly as they could, 30 or so men, including Barentsz, had piled into their boats with any and every weapon they could lay hands on. But in the meantime, they simply had to watch in horror as the beast tore off pieces of yet another friend. Well, as the relief force went ashore, 3 men stepped up. De Vere, the 3 that went forward in that sort were Cornelis Jacobson, maester of William Barentz's ship, William Geerson, pilot of the pinnace, and Hans von Nilfen, William Barentz's purser. And after that, the said maester and pilot had shot 3 times and missed. The purser, stepping somewhat further forward and seeing the bear to be within the length of a shot, presently levelled his piece, and, discharging it at the bear, shot her in the head between both eyes. And yet she still held the man fast by the neck, and lifted her head with the man still in her mouth. But she began somewhat to stagger, Wherewith the purser and a Scotsman drew their cutlasses and struck at her so hard that their cutlasses burst. And yet she would not leave the man. At last William Gerson went to them, and with all his might struck the bear upon the snout with his piece, at which time the bear fell to the ground, making a great noise, and William Gerson, leaping upon her, cut her throat. The 7th of September we buried the dead bodies of our men on States Island, and having flensed the bear, carried her skins with us to Amsterdam. Get it, De Vere. And as De Vere said, they eventually flayed her corpse, saving the skin and teeth and claws for gifts for their benefactors, along with rendering her fat down into lamp oil. And depressingly, when they opened her stomach, it was empty, save for a few pieces of human meat and torn clothing. It would seem that she had been desperate, half-starved and willing to take risks that a healthy bear never would have. Well, the officers must have sighed a bit at this new development. They had sent men ashore to improve morale, not lose 2 more sailors to a freak monster attack. But regardless, they were out here to do a job, and they hoped that getting back to work would take the crew's mind off of recent events. Well, the officers assembled and began to make plans to set out. They went back and forth with Barentsz and a few other crewmen still pushing to either try for the Straits of Nassau, or at the very least be allowed to win her over and try the northern route next spring. But Admiral Ney was having none of it. Aside from this being a deviation from their orders, Ney had other concerns, as recently the men had begun to grow surly, and morale was nearing its lowest point. He knew all too well that the crew couldn't handle much more, and so again he told Barentsz to shut the hell up if he knew it was good for him. Now, according to the book Icebound, as if to vindicate Old Man Ney, a group of sailors mutinied not long afterwards. You know, probably because the officers just saw 2 guys get eaten by a white monster and were like, oh, that sucks. Anyway, back to work. And not much is written specifically about the uprising, but one can assume this men's state of mind at this point. They had already lost 7 men. 4 when Barentz's own ship the Greyhound had run against the side of the Hope. Another was torn in half during a freak keel-hauling accident. And now 2 more were dead on the beach, killed by a massive polar bear. And not just the deaths, but disappointment stalked the men's hearts. For they had hoped to be on their way to China by now, sailing a proven route east. I mean, they just wanted their damn rewards. And each nursed secret dreams of the delights of the Orient, of women, wine, and riches freely given. But none of this would come to pass. No, their lot was to freeze and suffer at the top of the world, led on by men more worried about what the investors back home thought than the safety of their own crew. Well, despite the men's delusions, as well as their very real grievances, the rebellion was put down in short order by the Marines accompanying the expedition. It would seem that the fighting men were made of much sterner stuff, and without their support, the mutiny was doomed. Well, when the dust settled and the crew was cowed, 5 men had been lined up, all fingered as ringleaders and rabble-rousers. The rebels were then brought to a beach not far from where the bear had mauled their 2 crewmates, and there, nooses were placed around their neck, and all 5 were hanged by the neck until dead. States Island had now claimed 7 souls, this making 12 deaths so far. On September 9th, the fleet tried to tack around States Island and push back through the Straits of Nassau, but were turned back. And as they threaded their way back, Ney's own ship, the Griffin, ground hard on some rocks. He was stuck, and the next ship in the line, not seeing this for what it was, also grounded itself in the same manner. They were stuck too. Well, every sailor feared the hulls being smashed as each wave lifted their ships, only to smash them down on the rocks below, each swell potentially disastrous. And the rest of the day was spent dumping cargo to lighten the ship and using any and every means at their disposal to lever free. Anything. A few days later, the weather again turned fair, and the men allowed themselves a small portion of hope. Maybe this weather was a sign from God. Maybe he had been testing them and found them worthy after all. Well, no matter the why, they decided that it was worthwhile to try the Straits of Nassau one last time. They got as far as the beach they had regrouped at last year, a place called List Hook. And just as disappointment began to morph into bitterness, the winds shifted, and they were pinned into their harbor once again. Well, with little better to do while they waited, some of the men went ashore, this time armed with large caliber guns and pikes. After poking around for a bit, they found a rotting whale skeleton of all things flopped up on a nearby beach. And so, as a consolation, they hacked up the skeleton and took it with them back to the ship. By September 15th, Ney was just finished. He was done with the ice, done with the Straits, but most of all, he was just done with his freaking crew. It was obvious to him, at least, that the last year had been a fluke, that the stern merchants from his hometown had been right. Well, Barentsz again protested at this. He wanted to try north. I mean, surely Ney could spare 2 ships. With them, he could at least try the route he had discovered last year. I mean, they were already here. May as well, right? Well, Ney simply glared at him and told him that he could do whatever he wanted, but there would be consequences for stealing expedition property and insubordination when they got home. Just a nicer way of saying, I'll hang you too. Mess around and find out. And at this point, even the other officers were getting sick of this kind of talk. I mean, no one wanted to go north. The crew and the officers just wanted to go home and put this whole dog and pony show behind them. I mean, the entire trip up to this point had been an unqualified disaster. No use trying to polish a turd. Soon a council of officers and merchant representatives was called and a letter of explanation drafted, a document upon which all notables of the fleet were forced to sign their names. In this document, they all swore that they had tried their utmost, but that weather and ice would not allow their passage east. This document was now an almost fatal blow to the Dutch search for the Northeast Passage. For if they couldn't even pass Voyages, it didn't really matter how ice-free the Kara Sea was. They would always be stuck on the wrong side of it. Well, the next day, they took advantage of a break in the weather and clawed their way free of the ice around Lesthoek. They made great time on their way west, tacking the way to open seas faster than anyone could have expected. A development that at least eased morale a bit. But in one last slap to the face, a storm soon rolled in, brutal and wild. The ships did their best to stay together, but it was no use. The tempest eventually scattered the 7-ship fleet to the 4 winds. Now some of them were full weeks behind the others, thrown God knows where, and all this in just a single night. It wouldn't be until November 18th that the last 2 ships would limp back to Holland, haggard and broken, their crews already in the early stages of scurvy, gums pale and bleeding, bearing uneasy, and minds a jumbled mess of tangled thoughts. The voyage had been an almost unqualified disaster, and few if any were happy with the year's push. The fleet had not in fact made it to China. Hell, they hadn't even made it past the Straits of Nassau, a feat that Ney himself had managed just the year before. Well, Admiral Ney and the officers gave out what gifts they could to the expedition's backers as a palliative. Some exotic pelts, a few teeth and claws, and part of a whale skeleton. Not much of a payout for men that were supposed to have established a new route to China, supposed authors of a new Dutch age. And von Linschoten, for his part, began to distance himself from the North, quickly moving on to the next phase of his life as a national treasure and man about town. Far from El Dorado or a new Silk Road, the merchants of the Dutch Republic found the far north to be an empty place full of ice and monsters, and never again would they put forward such resources, as the North had now proved itself to be too unpredictable, an unsafe bet. On the next episode of Barentsz at Sea, behold as the mighty and arrogant men of the North are forced to eat crow, the glory seekers soon melting back into the population. But just because the profit hounds and so-called serious men had abandoned the project didn't mean the venture was scrapped. Far from it. For in the next episode, we'll describe the 3rd voyage, one that would become the stuff of legends, making heroes of everyone involved, and indeed fetching that very immortality that they had sought to achieve by reaching the fabled shores of Kaffian. Until then, this has been Storytime. I've been your host, Andrew Jackson, wishing you safe travels and dry socks. If you like what you heard, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every little bit helps. Thank you.